This week's video is going to be another airbrush review, and today we're looking at the SOTAR 2020 made by Badger. Hopefully the audio quality is better in this review than my others. I improved the audio settings and I'm trying to speak up, so hopefully this sounds better. So this SOTAR 2020 is equipped with a 0.2mm needle and nozzle combo and has a fixed 2.5ml paint cup which is gravity fed. If you watched my guide to detailed airbrushes, you'll know that I love this airbrush. So before I start praising it, I want to talk about some of the negatives, and the first thing is the finishing. If we use the microscope to look inside the paint cup, you'll see that the finishing is poor. This is nowhere near the finishing you'd get from a Harder & Steenbeck or an Iwata. And the version we're looking at right now is brand new. I never used this, so this is the way it came from the factory. There's no polishing within the paint cup or use of a chrome coating. The machining of individual parts is about the same quality, and unfortunately, it's not that great either. But if we take a look at the needle, you'll see that there's an extremely high polish on it, and this is one of the best quality needles I think I've seen from any brand. The polishing on the nozzle is also nearly flawless, and the needle sits perfectly aligned within that nozzle. The exterior of the SOTAR has a black, almost matte finish. I'm happy to say that it's very durable. I have another model that's about 11 years old, and there's no chipping or cracking on it whatsoever. So I'm going to quickly break down the airbrush to show you the individual parts. This model came with a cap to protect the needle and nozzle, and you're able to unscrew and retract the needle without removing the handle. On all my other airbrushes, I removed the handle so I could adjust the needle easily and quickly. And on the SOTAR, I can keep the handle on while painting, so I absolutely love this feature. The rear handle is also equipped with a trigger stop. I know some people like to use it, so it's a welcomed addition. After removing the rear handle, we have access to the needle locking nut, which secures the needle into the body of the airbrush. Next, we can unscrew the tube housing, which has a fine thread and takes a long time to unscrew. Once removed, we have access to the needle guide and the spring assembly. The tube housing is very thin and it almost feels like stamped metal, and I've bent quite a few of these on other SOTARs trying to remove them from the body. The nozzle assembly can be removed with this small wrench or spanner that comes with the airbrush, and this assembly is made up of 5 thin parts that are difficult to remove. To me, this is the most annoying airbrush to take apart and clean. Although I love the SOTAR, trying to clean it and disassemble it is very frustrating. The first part inside this nozzle assembly is this very small PTFE seal. Connected to the nozzle head is the spray regulator and the cap, both of which hold down this tiny grain of rice sized nozzle. Since the nozzle is free floating, it's easy for it to fall out of the airbrush, so you need to be careful with it. When I take this nozzle out of the airbrush, you can see just how small it is. But since replacement parts for Badger airbrushes are inexpensive, it's great to have a few extra needles and nozzles on hand for when you break your airbrush. And if you're like me, that's about once every few months, so it's nice to have extra parts for replacement. So let's move on to the next part and take a look at the spray pattern. If I spray at 20 psi with the needle fully retracted, you can see that we get a spray angle of about 16.3 degrees. For a detail airbrush, this is pretty good. It's slightly larger than the Infinity and the Micron, but still great to get in close to add some micro details. Spraying through the atomometer at 3.5 inches away, we get an airspeed of 4.9 meters per second. So this airspeed is right in between the Micron and the Infinity. And at 4.9 meters per second, it feels very comfortable to get close to your artwork without worrying about too much air blowing back. Now, as we move along to the response rate, I'm going to show you why I think this is one of the best airbrushes out there. When you press down on the trigger to get air, it's less than 3/4 of a millimeter. And when you pull back for paint, it's an instant response rate. In testing, I get less than 1/4 of a millimeter back for paint. And honestly, I think it's less than that, but these numbers are so small that it's difficult to measure. Performance-wise, I think the SOTAR 2020 is the most responsive airbrush I've ever used. Now, I love the Iwata Micron to death, but I think the SOTAR 2020 is slightly more responsive than it. And that's a bold statement for an airbrush that costs about 1/4 of the price of the Micron. But if you're looking for control in an airbrush, I don't think you're going to find it better from any other company. Holding the airbrush right off the surface of a piece of paper, I'm trying to spray the thinnest lines I possibly can. As I said in my previous reviews, you can get a thin line from any airbrush out there. And the SOTAR 2020 is no different, with a line width of about 0.2 millimeters. So let's move along to some simple painting tests so that I can talk about my opinions of this airbrush. So the first thing I'm painting is an oversimplified portrait. This is basically like a sketch, and I'm using one color here that I mixed with Createx illustration colors for just a basic flesh tone. I thin down the paint with some distilled water, and the airbrush sprays it absolutely beautifully. The trigger is very close to the nozzle, so it's really nice to choke up and get very close to your artwork to spray in those details. And I don't really understand why this is, but this airbrush doesn't seem to clog much. Of course you get some tip dry, but that's no problem because you can clean the needle very easily. But overall, there there was no clogging and no spitting of paint, so I'm very happy with the way this performs. The one thing that I'm not crazy about while painting with this airbrush is that you definitely notice that higher airspeed when you compare it to an Iwata Micron. Now this is subjective and probably just my personal preference, but I don't like when I move in very close to the piece of paper or to the canvas and I feel that air blowing back. It makes it challenging to paint in small hairs like very small eyelashes. Now I don't paint any sort of models, but I'd imagine that you guys that paint very small ones like miniatures may find this slightly annoying. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it is something that I noticed and would like to point out. And the last thing I'm going to paint is a very simple kind of kitschy landscape here, but it's good because I could spray some white. So what I did was I mixed some white in with this blue, and if you're new to airbrushing you may not know this, but white has titanium dioxide in it, and it's definitely one of the thicker pigments and one of the more challenging ones to spray through any airbrush. But spraying at around 20 psi, I have zero complaints. It sprayed absolutely perfectly. This also is Createx illustration colors, and this time I didn't dilute it. I used it right out of the bottle. So if you ever use Createx illustration, you'll know that it's a pretty thick paint. Although the pigments are finely ground, it can be challenging to spray this paint through some smaller detail airbrushes. So for those of you who like to use thicker paints or use brands that aren't marketed or really made for using in an airbrush, should be fine with this one. And the last thing I want to check are the seals. So what I'm doing here is placing some soapy water right onto the nozzle, and you can see with my left thumb there I'm holding down the trigger and there's no leaks. If the nozzle leaks on the SOTAR 2020, it's not a big deal. You can buy some beeswax. I think even Badger sells a specific beeswax that you can add right onto the nozzles, and you basically just put it on with a toothpick and screw it back together. Once everything is screwed down hand tight, you should be good to go. So that's going to do it for this quick review. The SOTAR 2020 is an excellent airbrush, and I think it's great for anyone from the beginner all the way up to the experienced painter. And for that amazing price of only $100 US, this is a hard airbrush to ignore. So if you're looking for a great detail airbrush, you can't go wrong with the Badger SOTAR 2020. So I hope this video was helpful for those of you who are looking to pick up the SOTAR. I'm going to have plenty more airbrush reviews coming up in the next few months. I'm probably going to do about one a month for the next year or so. And of course, I'm going to have plenty more painting lessons coming up. So as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.